So with that, I have the pleasure of introducing Irwin Yellowitz, who is one of the longtime leaders of the PSC, one of the founding members of the PSC, and a powerful labor historian, a very important force, and I must say a very generous force for us as part of the leadership that we opposed when we first came into leadership. Irwin always took such beautiful and principled positions, even in disagreement. I always felt that I could count on him to voice a disagreement strongly, but graciously, and to understand that at the heart we're working together on a union project, a labor project, and we've been very lucky to have Irwin in leadership positions for many, many years at the PSC, and very lucky to have him tonight. So he's going to start, and then Steve London will pick up.
Since we were giving biographies, I'll give you a very short one of myself. I joined the UFCT, which I'll mention in a moment what it is. It was one of the predecessor organizations to the PSC in 1965. And I hope everybody was alive in 1965 in this room. Maybe not. Maybe not. And I was an officer of the union from the founding of the PSC in 1972, which I'll get to in a minute, until I retired in 1997. I was vice president for senior colleges and then treasurer. And Naomi said I should take 15 minutes. I'll try. I won't go too much over. And so I'm going to focus on a few basic themes that I think characterize the history of the union. And I'll get up to 1990, and then Steve will take over from there. And I hope after that we'll have some time to discuss the history, and then I can go into some of the details that I'm going to pass over for a point of time. First of all, the PSC is a democratic union. It has always been a democratic union. It was formed out of the competition of two prior organizations. One called the Legislative Conference, which was founded in 1939 and was headed by Belle Zeller. She was the president from 1944 until the merger. And Belle was a remarkable person. I don't have the time to go into it, but a woman holding that position in 1944 was highly unusual. A woman being a professor at Brooklyn College in the 1930s was also highly unusual. So she was a remarkable person. And one little note about her, she was the last of 11 children to be born and the last of 11 to die. That's a rather remarkable thing. The other organization that formed the merger was the United Federation of College Teachers. That's the group I joined in 1965. It was headed by Israel Kugler, another remarkable person. He believed very strongly that an organization could be formed among college professors, that organization would be a union, and that union would be part of the labor movement. Now, all three of those were contested issues. They were not accepted. They were the minority view. And as a matter of fact, even the Legislative Conference was an independent organization, did not claim to be a union, and was not affiliated with the labor movement. So there was a very sharp difference in outlook between the two of them. The UFCT came out of the UFT, United Federation of Teachers, and was supported by them very strongly up through the merger. So we had two organizations. The LC was the older, stronger among the full-time faculty, a long tradition, a lobbying group, great successes in Albany. And the other organization, I think, was more vigorous and more tuned in to the labor movement. The Taylor Law was passed in 1967, which allowed collective bargaining for public employees in New York State. It had some very, very negative features, especially about strikes, but also other areas. But one of the things that it had at its heart was the provision of collective bargaining elections, and both the LC and the UFCT decided that they would try to organize the faculty at CUNY into a union. They came into direct competition with each other. It led to a very complicated conflict, which dragged over 5 years, led to several collective bargaining elections, and ultimately to the LC being the collective bargaining representative of one part of the faculty, the full-time, annually appointed faculty, and the UFCT being the collective bargaining representative of the adjuncts, non-tenurable lecturers in those days, and any other title that was considered to be part-time. They negotiated contracts with CUNY in 1969. The two organizations, each was a collective bargaining agent for part of the CUNY instructional staff. But the competition continued. And the UFCT challenged the LC in its unit. Now again, and I'd love to go into the details of that, they really had a stronger chance in that unit, even though the LC was the established organization. And if there had been one unit, they would have clearly won the election. But there wasn't. The state Public Employees Retirement Board had separated the faculty. That's where the division took place. It got even more complicated when the two national organizations of teachers, the NEA and the AFT, became involved in this CUNY struggle. The Legislative Conference gave up its independence because as part of the conflict it needed money, it didn't have it much, so it joined the NEA. The NEA immediately provided it with a loan of $100,000, which in those days, 1970, that was a lot of money. A loan that I don't think they ever paid back, by the way. It was a loan, but it was a loan that was never going to be seen again. The UFCT was supported by the AFT. The UFT constantly poured money into it. So both organizations were being funded by other organizations that were in conflict between them on a national scale. Well, the PSC eventually, the struggle between the two national organizations came to a temporary halt in 1972, when the two agreed that they were going to form a united teachers movement in the state of New York. And they called it the New York State United Teachers. And it had all the NEA and all of the AFT locals. Well, what were they going to do with this PSC or with this CUNY situation in which these two competing unions were still in very active competition? They leaned on them to merge. And the negotiations were very difficult, because you had two very strong people there, Bell Zeller and Is Kugel. I knew them both very well, and you did not want to argue with either one. And if they were arguing with each other, it was not an easy situation. But finally, a merger was accomplished in April of 1972. And Professional Staff Congress was chosen as the name because it had none of the names of any of the predecessor. No legislative, no conference, no united, no union. The Federation of College Teachers didn't have union in it either. The word union did not come into either of the predecessor groups. And the United Federation of Teachers doesn't have union in it. So the word union, in the 1960s, the idea of organizing professionals, doctors, teachers, nurses, was just considered impossible. So the word union was not usually thrown into the title of an organization. UUP didn't use it. In SUNY, they used that very strange name they still have, United University Professions. Professions, not professionals, professions. So the PSC was set up. Bell Zeller became the president. Is Kugler became the deputy president. And Is told me, he told a lot of other people, that Bell Zeller, who was much older, had told him, I only want to be president for 1 year. And then you'll take over. Well, along comes 1973, the first election now under the merged PSC, and Bell doesn't know anything about such an agreement. So they ran against each other. They formed two opposing caucuses, and they ran against each other in a very tight election. Bell won by 200 votes. And to make it even more complicated, there was a third candidate.
Eugene Debs.
Edgar Pauk. Eugene Debs didn't quite make it. 1926, he was gone. Edgar Pauk, who was a member of the UFCT from Queens College and had a, to me, still undefined argument with Is Kugler about what I could never quite determine. But he ran as an independent and got 300 votes. Now, did those 300 votes, were those Is Kugler's 300 votes? I think they were. But that's right, the Ralph Nader effect before Ralph Nader. We don't know for sure, but it was very close. The union remained divided because Is won some seats on the Executive Council and some in the Delegate Assembly. And then the fiscal crisis came, and I'll get to that in just a minute. So this union that was divided between these two opposing caucuses had to face the most difficult crisis in its entire history. It did, and it did very well, and I'll get to that. 1976, Bell did retire, and Is Kugler ran against Irwin Polishuk. Now, Irwin Polishuk was Bell Zeller's first vice president, the title first vice president, and he defeated Is Kugler rather substantially, and Is then disbanded his caucus, and the two merged together so that 5 years later, and I do not exaggerate, the leadership of the union was made up of people from both of these caucuses, but no one remembered which caucus the other people had been in. I remembered what caucus I had been in, but you no longer identified that way. You now identified as the leadership of the PSC. Now, Irwin was president until he retired in 2000, and the democracy of the union continued because the new caucus appeared in the 1990s, and Steve will pick up on that. And again, there were competitive elections in the 1990s. There were not competitive elections between 1976 and 1993, I guess at the general union level. And the new caucus took over in 2000, and there have been contested elections since. So we have a democratic union and have always had a democratic union and were formed out of the democratic process. So that's the first point. Second, CUNY opposed collective bargaining. CUNY fought to the end against a first contract. Both of these are what you would expect from an employer. Public, private, it doesn't matter. And that's exactly what we got. those first two contracts that I mentioned in 1969, they were negotiated fairly easily. But the next one, when the merged union tried to negotiate it in 1972, that contract went to impasse. It went to fact-finding. The union membership voted twice to call a strike. And finally, the fact-finders reported and essentially agreed with the union position. So the PSC accepted the fact-finders' report. CUNY rejected it. And the politicians, the New York Times, and everybody else jumped on them for their intransigence, and they had to give in.
Those 73, what year was that again?
1973. The negotiations went on for that time. Then came the fiscal crisis almost on top of that first contract. Imagine this is the union that was still divided in its own leadership, had to face that first contract with an intransigent employer, and then go into the fiscal crisis. And the fiscal crisis would affect the university in many serious ways. But it would have been incomparably worse had it not been for the PSC. And that's my next point, that a union is necessary to protect the interests of its members and often to protect the interests of the institution that the union is in, or the business that the union is in. Because the employer's notion of that is narrow and will not necessarily, despite the fact that employers will tell you over and over again that they are concerned about the interests of their workers, they are to a point, but not to the point where it interferes with profits or control. So the 1970s fiscal crisis, there were cutbacks in budget, of course. There were threats that there would be wide-scale firings of tenured faculty. There would be a reorganization of CUNY. There would be closings of colleges. There would be a payless furlough, and there would be the end of tuition, free tuition. Well, some of those things happened in part, but they would have happened in a much worse way without the union. We did lose free tuition, but we at least got TAP, which was negotiated as part of that arrangement. We did not have a payless furlough. We had a 2-week deferral of pay, which was paid back to us in the 1980s with interest. We lost faculty, but we did not lose a great number of tenured faculty. We lost mostly adjuncts, untenured people. I lost 7 in my history department at City College. Bright, good people, just knocked out without any concern for their merit. The budget was cut so that we were starved. The libraries stopped buying books, and on down the line. Administrative positions were hit much harder than teaching positions. But the university held together, and the reorganization and closing of colleges did not take place. There was a proposal from my president, Robert Marshak at City College, to take the 4 old senior colleges, as he called them, Brooklyn, Queens, City, and Hunter, and move them into SUNY. Just take them right out, Leo. The rest of you can stay behind. We'll go into SUNY and be funded as university centers much more generously than we're funded now. That was defeated. The Chancellor, Robert Kibbe, wanted to close several colleges, including John Jay, Hostos, Richmond, which then was merged into with the College of Staten Island, with the Staten Island Community College to form COSI. But none of that happened either. If it hadn't been for the PSC, all of these things would have happened, all of them, because they were all out there on the table. They were not just vague dreams. And finally, in the 1980s, much better period. And my point here is that a union has some influence, as we certainly did in the 1970s, but it does not operate in an island, and it does not operate without the impact of the larger world. So in the 70s, the PSC could only do so much because the whole of New York City's financial world was collapsing. And so you could do so much, but no more. In the 1980s, the union made great gains because the environment in New York had changed substantially. And other unions did well also. Just give you some of the idea what happened in the 1980s, and then I'll turn it over to Steve. Salaries increased substantially, and this helped attract faculty to CUNY. TIA-CREF, those people in TIA-CREF today, when you retire, you have after retirement health benefits. That only came in 1984, even though TIA-CREF was established in CUNY in 1968. Now imagine if you're a TIA retiree, and that had not, I consider that to be one of the greatest achievements of the PSC. Because imagine going into retirement without health benefits. And New York City and New York State had to sign off on that, and they did not want it. I was part of that negotiation. They absolutely did not want it. It was expensive. There was a public system. Go into the public system, which has after retirement health benefits. And they were not interested in encouraging TI-CREF anyway because it was a private system and they had to pay money into it. They could not play financial games with the way they do with TRS. So that's a biggie. That's a biggie. Couldn't have happened except in the 1980s. The welfare fund underwent some very significant changes. First of all, retirees got a per capita payment. Now, I'm a retiree and I'm very happy that there's a per capita payment so retirees can look on welfare benefits as a continuation of their in-service benefits because there's a per capita being paid for them. That was not true until 1982. The retirees had almost nothing from the welfare fund. Adjuncts got a health plan through the welfare fund. And that was difficult to negotiate because basically that was a very unusual feature. Other colleges didn't want to give adjuncts health benefits. They didn't want to give adjuncts anything because they're cheap labor and temporary labor, and therefore there was no reason to give them benefits. So to get this was very unusual. And finally, the Women's Coalition. Women's Coalition was headed by a professor from Brooklyn College named Lelia Milani. She almost single-handedly did the research to prove, she was convinced, absolutely convinced, that women had been discriminated in CUNY beginning in 1968 and continuing onward in salaries, in promotions, and so on. She did a lot of research on her own, but she could not make the case on her own. She needed the help of an established law firm, and she got it from Judith Vladeck of the Vladeck Law Firm, and the PSC paid the bill. They won the lawsuit, and CUNY eventually had to make damage payments to all of the women who had been in service from 1968 to 1983. And there was a whole process for determining what the damages were. It varied with the person. So those are some of the things that took place in the 1980s because the world had shifted substantially, but it didn't stay shifted very long. And I'll turn it over to Steve because in the 1990s, just about everything that was happening to the advantage of CUNY faculty and staff in the 80s was reversed.